George Pullman was a Chicago industrialist and a complex business figure who became one of the most controversial entrepreneurs of the Gilded Age. George Mortimer Pullman, railroad car manufacturer and later town builder, was born in Brockton, New York on March 3, 1831. He came from a modest family. He had a keen business sense and an eye for opportunity. Pullman's early years were marked by ambition and determination. He received only a basic education, leaving school at age 14 to work with his father, a carpenter and general contractor. His practical education in construction and engineering shaped his understanding of mechanics and business, though his later career would test those lessons in the most brutal ways imaginable. After his father's death in 1853, Pullman took over the family business at age 22. He moved to Chicago, a rapidly growing city that offered opportunities for an ambitious young contractor. He was hired to raise buildings and streets above the marshy ground that plagued the city. It was during this time that Pullman began developing his ideas about engineering solutions to practical problems. His most famous project involved raising the Tremorne House Hotel for feet while guests continued to occupy the building. The feat demonstrated his engineering skill and brought him recognition in Chicago business circles. In 1858, Pullman turned his attention to a problem that had long troubled railroad passengers: the discomfort of overnight train travel. He had experienced firsthand the crude sleeping cars then in use, which were little more than regular coaches with wooden bunks. Pullman believed he could design something far superior. He converted two passenger cars on the Chicago and Alton Railroad into sleeping cars with his own money. The cars featured folding upper berths and seat cushions that could be extended to form lower berths. However, despite the improvements, the cars were still cramped and uncomfortable. The venture showed promise but needed refinement. Pullman's business venture initially showed limited success. His sleeping cars attracted some attention from railroad officials and travelers alike. However, despite the technical merits of his design, the business side of the enterprise proved challenging. Railroads were reluctant to invest in expensive passenger accommodations. They questioned whether travelers would pay premium fares for sleeping berths. Competition from other sleeping car manufacturers also threatened his enterprise. Pullman realized he needed something revolutionary, not merely improved. In 1859, Pullman temporarily left the railroad car business and moved to Colorado, where gold had been discovered. He operated a trading post in the mining camps, selling supplies to prospectors. The venture was profitable and allowed him to accumulate capital for his future plans. During his time in Colorado, Pullman continued to refine his vision for the perfect sleeping car. He sketched designs and calculated costs. By 1863, he had saved enough money and was ready to return to Chicago to pursue his dream. After returning to Chicago, Pullman began work on his masterpiece. He invested $20,000, an enormous sum at the time, to build a sleeping car unlike anything previously seen. The car, named Pioneer, was completed in 1864. It was larger, more luxurious, and more expensive than any previous sleeping car. The Pioneer featured elaborate woodwork, plush upholstery, and innovative mechanical systems for converting seats into beds. It had marble washstands, ornate oil lamps, and fine linens. The car was so large that it could not fit on most railroad lines, being too wide and too tall for existing platforms and bridges. The Pioneer sat unused for months because railroads refused to modify their infrastructure to accommodate it. Pullman's investment seemed destined to fail. However, legend holds that fate intervened when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. When Lincoln's funeral train carried his body from Washington back to Springfield, Illinois, the Pioneer was supposedly attached to the train. Railroads along the route hastily modified their platforms and bridges to allow the magnificent car to pass. Whether this story is entirely accurate remains debated by historians, but the Pioneer did eventually run on the Chicago and Alton Railroad, and its success launched Pullman's empire. Following the success of the Pioneer, Pullman formed the Pullman Palace Car Company in 1867. His business model was innovative for its time. Rather than selling sleeping cars to railroads, Pullman retained ownership of the cars and leased them to railroad companies. The railroads paid Pullman a fee per mile traveled, and Pullman's company maintained and staffed the cars. This arrangement gave Pullman control over quality and service while generating steady revenue. Passengers paid a supplemental fare to use the sleeping cars, which was split between the railroad and Pullman's company. Pullman sleeping cars quickly became the standard for luxury rail travel. He continually improved his designs, introducing innovations like the dining car in 1868 and the chair car for day travel. By the 1870s, Pullman Palace cars were operating on most major railroads across America. The distinctive dark green cars with gold lettering became symbols of elegance and comfort. Wealthy travelers demanded Pullman accommodations, and even middle-class passengers saved money to experience the luxury of sleeping in a Pullman berth. The company's success made Pullman enormously wealthy. By 1875, the Pullman Palace Car Company was manufacturing cars at a large facility in Detroit. However, Pullman envisioned something grander, a purpose-built town where his cars would be manufactured and his workers would live. In 1880, he purchased 4,000 acres of land south of Chicago, near Lake Calumet. There he would build his ideal community, a town that would bear his name and embody his vision of industrial efficiency and social order. The town of Pullman, Illinois, was designed from the ground up as a model industrial community. Pullman hired architect Solon Spencer Beman and landscape designer Nathan Barrett to create a town that would be both functional and beautiful. Construction began in 1880 and proceeded rapidly. By 1881, the first workers were moving into company-owned houses. The town featured neat rows of brick houses, wide streets, parks, and public buildings. There was a hotel, a church, a library, a theater, shops, and schools. Everything was owned by the Pullman Company. Pullman's vision for his town was paternalistic and controlling. He believed that by providing workers with clean, comfortable housing and wholesome surroundings, he could create a more productive and loyal workforce. Workers would be free from the corrupting influences of saloons and slums that plagued other industrial cities. In return for these benefits, workers would accept company control over virtually every aspect of their lives. Rent was deducted directly from wages. The company determined who could live in the town and who would be evicted. No alcohol was sold except at the hotel, which was too expensive for workers. No independent newspapers or organizations were allowed. Initially, the town of Pullman was praised as a progressive experiment in industrial relations. Visitors came from around the world to tour the model community. Newspapers published glowing accounts of the clean streets, attractive houses, and contented workers. Pullman himself was celebrated as an enlightened capitalist who cared for his employees' welfare. The town won awards at industrial exhibitions. Reformers held it up as an example of how capitalism could be humanized through enlightened management. However, beneath the attractive surface, resentment was growing among Pullman workers. They chafed under the company's control. They resented paying rent to their employer, knowing that Pullman was profiting from their housing. They disliked the restrictions on their freedom and the constant surveillance by company officials. They complained that rents were higher than for comparable housing in nearby communities. They noted that while Pullman preached about his concern for workers, he was also making enormous profits from the town's operations. The Pullman Company continued to prosper through the 1880s. The business expanded internationally, with Pullman cars operating in Europe and Asia. Pullman himself became one of America's wealthiest men. He built a mansion on Prairie Avenue in Chicago, the most fashionable address in the city. He socialized with other industrial titans like Marshall Field and Philip Armour. He served on corporate boards and invested in various enterprises. His success seemed to validate his business methods and his vision of industrial paternalism. In 1893, the United States entered a severe economic depression. The Panic of 1893 caused widespread business failures and unemployment. The Pullman Company saw demand for its luxury railroad cars plummet as railroads cancelled orders. Pullman responded by laying off workers and cutting wages for those who remained. Wages were reduced by an average of 25%. However, Pullman did not reduce rents in his company town or the prices at company stores. Workers found themselves with sharply reduced incomes but unchanged living expenses. The wage cuts without corresponding rent reductions created desperate conditions for Pullman workers. Many could barely afford food after rent was deducted from their paychecks. Some workers received paychecks for only a few cents after all deductions. Families went hungry. Workers pleaded with company officials for rent reductions or wage increases, but their appeals were rejected. The company maintained that business conditions necessitated the wage cuts and that the town's finances were separate from the manufacturing operations, so rents could not be adjusted. In May 1894, Pullman workers went on strike. They demanded wage increases, rent reductions, and recognition of their union. The strike began peacefully with workers simply refusing to work. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, supported the Pullman workers. In June, the ARU called for a boycott of all trains pulling Pullman cars. Railroad workers across the country refused to handle Pullman cars. The boycott paralyzed rail traffic throughout the western United States. Mail delivery was disrupted. Commerce ground to a halt. The conflict escalated from a local labor dispute to a national crisis. George Pullman refused to negotiate with the strikers. He rejected calls for arbitration. He insisted that there was nothing to arbitrate, that the company had every right to set wages and rents as it saw fit. He left Chicago for his summer home in New Jersey, leaving subordinates to deal with the crisis. His absence and his refusal to compromise hardened positions on both sides. The strike became a test of wills between labor and capital, with Pullman representing the absolute authority of employers. The federal government intervened in the strike, siding with the railroad companies and Pullman. President Grover Cleveland, citing disruption of mail delivery, sent federal troops to Chicago over the objections of Illinois Governor John Peter Altgeld. The arrival of troops led to violence. Rioting broke out. Railroad cars were burned. Strikers clashed with soldiers. Several people were killed. Eugene Debs was arrested for violating a federal injunction against interfering with the mails. The strike was broken by force. By July 1894, the Pullman strike was over. Workers returned to their jobs defeated, accepting the reduced wages and unchanged rents. Many strike leaders were blacklisted and never worked for Pullman again. The American Railway Union was destroyed. Eugene Debs went to prison. George Pullman had won the immediate battle, but the victory came at enormous cost to his reputation. Public opinion, which had initially supported suppression of the strike, turned against Pullman when the workers' conditions became widely known. A federal commission investigated the strike and issued a scathing report on Pullman's labor practices. The commission found that the company's refusal to reduce rents while cutting wages was unreasonable and had provoked the strike. It criticized the paternalistic system of the company town, noting that it gave workers no voice in their living conditions. The report recommended that the company divest itself of the town and that Congress consider legislation to prevent future labor conflicts. The findings embarrassed Pullman and damaged his standing among fellow businessmen. In the aftermath of the strike, Pullman became a symbol of corporate greed and labor exploitation. Newspapers that had once praised his model town now condemned it as a gilded cage. Ministers preached sermons denouncing his treatment of workers. Reform organizations used Pullman as an example of everything wrong with industrial capitalism. His name, once synonymous with luxury and progress, became associated with oppression and conflict. The man who had sought to be remembered as an enlightened employer would instead be remembered as a tyrant. The Illinois Supreme Court ordered the Pullman Company to divest itself of all property not directly related to manufacturing. The company town, the court ruled, was beyond the legitimate scope of a manufacturing corporation. This decision forced the eventual dissolution of Pullman's model community. The town was annexed by Chicago in 1889, though the actual annexation occurred later, and the houses were eventually sold to private owners. Pullman's grand experiment in industrial paternalism was legally dismantled. George Pullman never recovered from the strike and its aftermath. His health declined. He became increasingly isolated, bitter about what he saw as public ingratitude for his efforts to improve workers' lives. He could not understand why his paternalistic system, which he genuinely believed was beneficial, had generated such hatred. He felt betrayed by workers he thought he had treated generously. The man who had built an empire on the promise of comfort and luxury found neither in his final years. Throughout his post-strike years, Pullman continued to manage his company, but the joy had gone out of the work. The Pullman Palace Car Company remained profitable and dominant in its industry. The sleeping cars continued to operate on railroads across America and around the world. But the company's founder was a broken man, his reputation destroyed and his vision discredited. He maintained his business interests and his wealth, but he had lost something more valuable, his belief in his own righteousness. Pullman married Hattie Amelia Sanger in 1867, and they had 4 children. His family life provided some comfort during his difficult final years. His wife and children remained loyal despite the public criticism. They maintained the social position that Pullman's wealth afforded, though they felt the sting of his damaged reputation. Pullman ensured his family would be financially secure, whatever happened to his personal legacy. On October 19, 1897, George Pullman died at his home in Chicago. He was 66 years old. The cause of death was reported as a heart attack, though some accounts suggest he had been suffering from various ailments for some time. Pullman's funeral was a modest affair, reflecting the family's desire to avoid public attention. He was buried in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. Fearing that his body might be stolen or desecrated by vengeful workers, his family had the coffin encased in tar paper and asphalt, then placed in a lead-lined vault, which was covered with concrete and railroad ties. The extraordinary measures reflected the depth of animosity that Pullman's labor policies had generated. In death, as in life, Pullman was remembered with a mixture of respect and resentment. His legacy is complex and contradictory. He was a genuine innovator who revolutionized railroad travel and created an industry. His sleeping cars made long-distance travel comfortable and accessible to millions. His business acumen built a commercial empire. Yet he was also a man whose paternalistic arrogance and refusal to compromise led to one of the most significant labor conflicts in American history. He cared about his workers in the abstract but refused to listen to them as individuals. He built them a beautiful town but denied them freedom and dignity. Modern historians have offered varied assessments of Pullman's legacy. Some emphasize his contributions to transportation and industrial development, noting that his innovations genuinely improved people's lives. They point out that his town, whatever its flaws, did provide better housing than most workers of that era enjoyed. They suggest that his paternalism, while misguided, came from a sincere belief that he knew what was best for his employees. Other historians focus on his labor practices, seeing Pullman as a symbol of Gilded Age exploitation and the arrogance of industrial capitalists who believed their wealth gave them the right to control workers' lives. The Pullman strike of 1894 had lasting consequences for American labor relations. It demonstrated the willingness of the federal government to use force to break strikes. It showed the power of industrial unions to disrupt the national economy. It raised questions about workers' rights and corporate power that would shape labor law for decades. The strike helped launch Eugene Debs's political career and contributed to the growth of the socialist movement in America. It remains one of the most studied labor conflicts in American history. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of George Pullman comes from recognizing the contradiction at the heart of his life's work. He built an empire on providing comfort and luxury to travelers while denying comfort and dignity to the workers who made that luxury possible. He created a model town that was admired for its physical beauty but despised by those forced to live there. He was an innovator who improved transportation but a reactionary who resisted changes in labor relations. He succeeded brilliantly in business but failed catastrophically in understanding human nature and human needs. Pullman represents a particular type of industrial leader common in the Gilded Age, the self-made man who believed his success proved his superiority and gave him the right to dictate how others should live. History is full of such figures, men who built great enterprises but whose paternalism and arrogance created conflict and suffering. Pullman's tragedy was that he never understood why his workers rejected his benevolence, why they preferred freedom and dignity to comfortable housing and steady employment under his control. In the end, George Pullman was neither a great benefactor nor a terrible villain, but rather a talented businessman who achieved remarkable success while failing to recognize the humanity and autonomy of his workers. His legacy includes both the revolutionary sleeping cars that transformed travel and the infamous strike that symbolized the conflict between labor and capital in industrial America. He is remembered today primarily for the strike and for the town that bore his name, which is perhaps unfair to a man who genuinely innovated and built, but also perhaps appropriate for a man whose arrogance and inflexibility caused such conflict. Pullman remained even in death a man of contradictions, remembered for his industrial achievements and his labor conflicts rather than for the complexity of his character and the sincerity of his misguided paternalism. Leland Stanford was a California titan and a complex figure who became one of the most influential businessmen and politicians of the Gilded Age. Amasa Leland Stanford, railroad magnate, governor, and university founder, was born in Watervliet, New York on March 9, 1824. He came from a farming family of modest means. He had an imposing physical presence and a determined demeanor. Stanford's early years were marked by ambition and a restless drive for success. He attended local schools in Albany County and later studied law at the Cazenovia Seminary. His legal education was largely self-directed, as was common in that era, supplemented by apprenticeship in various law offices. He was admitted to the bar in 1848 at age 24, and he established a law practice in Port Washington, Wisconsin. His education shaped his understanding of business and politics, though his later career would test those foundations in ways he could never have imagined. After several years practicing law in Wisconsin, Stanford married Jane Elizabeth Lathrop in 1850. The marriage would prove to be a partnership that lasted until his death, though it would be marked by both great wealth and profound tragedy. Jane came from a prosperous Albany family and brought social connections that would prove valuable in Stanford's rise. In 1852, disaster struck when a fire destroyed Stanford's law office and library. The loss was devastating, wiping out years of work and investment. Rather than rebuild in Wisconsin, Stanford made a fateful decision. He would go west to California where gold had been discovered just a few years earlier. He was not going to pan for gold himself but rather to sell goods to the miners, recognizing that the real money was in supplying the gold seekers rather than seeking gold himself. Stanford arrived in California in 1852 and joined his brothers who had already established themselves in the mining supply business. He settled in Michigan Bluff, a mining camp in Placer County, and opened a store selling provisions to miners. The business was successful, and Stanford proved to be a shrewd merchant. He understood the miners' needs and priced his goods accordingly. He expanded his operations, opening stores in Cold Springs and eventually in Sacramento, the growing commercial center of Northern California. By the mid-1850s, Stanford had accumulated considerable wealth from his mercantile operations. He had succeeded where many 49ers had failed, not by finding gold but by selling to those who sought it. Stanford's business success gave him the financial foundation to enter politics. He became involved in the Republican Party, which was newly formed in the 1850s around opposition to the expansion of slavery. California, though a free state, had a complex political landscape with strong Democratic Party dominance. Stanford's Republican politics were initially a liability in state politics, but the party was growing in strength. In 1857, Stanford was nominated as the Republican candidate for state treasurer but was defeated. The loss did not discourage him. He continued to build his political network and his business empire simultaneously. The late 1850s brought Stanford into contact with the men who would become his partners in the greatest business venture of the 19th century. He met Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, fellow merchants and Republicans who shared his vision of California's potential. These four men, who would later be known as the Big Four, began discussing the possibility of building a transcontinental railroad. The idea was audacious. A railroad spanning the continent would connect California to the eastern states, transforming commerce and settlement patterns. It would also make its builders extraordinarily wealthy and powerful. The driving force behind the transcontinental railroad idea was Theodore Judah, a brilliant engineer who had surveyed possible routes through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Judah needed financial backing, and he found it in Stanford and his associates. In 1861, the Central Pacific Railroad Company was incorporated with Stanford as president, Huntington as vice president, Hopkins as treasurer, and Crocker as construction supervisor. Each man brought different skills to the enterprise. Stanford provided political connections and respectability. Huntington managed finances and procurement. Hopkins kept the books. Crocker oversaw the actual construction. Together, they formed a formidable team. The timing of the railroad venture coincided with Stanford's entry into major political office. In 1861, with the Democratic Party split over the Civil War, Stanford was elected governor of California as a Republican. He was inaugurated in January 1862, becoming the state's 8th governor. His election was significant not just for his personal ambitions but for the Republican Party's establishment in California. Stanford's governorship would last only 2 years, but those years were crucial for both California and for his railroad enterprise. As governor during the Civil War, Stanford worked to keep California loyal to the Union. There were Confederate sympathizers in the state, and there were fears that California might remain neutral or even side with the South. Stanford's firm unionism helped ensure that California's gold and resources supported the Union cause. He also used his position to advance the interests of the Central Pacific Railroad. The Pacific Railroad Act, passed by Congress in 1862, authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad and provided federal support in the form of land grants and government bonds. Stanford's position as governor of California gave him influence in securing favorable terms for the Central Pacific. The company was designated to build eastward from Sacramento, while the Union Pacific would build westward from Omaha. The two lines would meet somewhere in between, though the exact location was left undetermined. This created a race, as each company would be compensated based on miles of track laid. Construction of the Central Pacific began in Sacramento on January 8, 1863, with Stanford turning the first shovel of earth in a ceremonial groundbreaking. The actual construction proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The route required crossing the Sierra Nevada, one of the most formidable mountain ranges in North America. The engineering challenges were immense. Tunnels had to be blasted through solid granite. Roadbeds had to be carved into sheer cliff faces. Winters brought snow measured in feet, sometimes burying work camps entirely. The physical obstacles were matched by financial and labor challenges. The Central Pacific struggled to find workers willing to endure the brutal conditions. The solution came in the form of Chinese immigrant labor. Charles Crocker, overseeing construction, initially resisted hiring Chinese workers, but labor shortages forced experimentation. The Chinese workers proved to be extraordinarily capable, performing dangerous work with skill and determination. Eventually, the workforce was predominantly Chinese, with thousands of immigrants laboring in the mountains. They worked with hand tools, black powder, and later nitroglycerine to blast through the Sierra granite. The human cost was terrible. Hundreds of workers died in accidents, explosions, and avalanches. The Chinese workers were paid less than white workers and faced discrimination and dangerous assignments, yet they persevered, building one of the engineering marvels of the age. Stanford's role in the railroad construction was primarily political and financial rather than operational. He lobbied in Washington for favorable legislation and additional subsidies. He negotiated with California officials for rights of way and local support. He helped secure the massive capital needed to keep construction moving forward. The Big Four invested their own money, but they also used creative and sometimes questionable financial arrangements to fund the project. They established construction companies that contracted with the railroad at inflated prices, allowing them to profit from both sides of the transaction. These practices, while legal at the time, would later be criticized as corrupt. After his term as governor ended in 1863, Stanford devoted himself fully to the railroad enterprise. The work continued through the mid-1860s with agonizing slowness. The Sierra crossing took years to complete. Summit Tunnel, the highest and longest of the mountain tunnels, required 15 months of continuous work. Workers labored in shifts around the clock, drilling and blasting through solid rock. When the Sierra was finally conquered, construction accelerated across the Nevada desert. The Central Pacific crews laid track at an increasing pace, racing against the Union Pacific crews coming from the east. The competition between the two railroads became intense. Each company wanted to build as many miles as possible to maximize their land grants and subsidies. The Union Pacific, building across the relatively flat Great Plains, initially had the advantage. But as they approached the Rocky Mountains, their progress slowed. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific, having conquered the Sierra, was laying track rapidly across Nevada and into Utah. The two lines approached each other in the spring of 1869. The meeting point was finally designated as Promontory Summit in Utah Territory. On May 10, 1869, the two railroads were joined in a ceremony that symbolized the unification of the continent. Stanford represented the Central Pacific at the ceremony. He was given the honor of driving the final spike, a golden spike specially made for the occasion. In one of history's memorable moments, Stanford swung the hammer and missed the spike entirely. The telegraph operator, who was supposed to send the signal done when the spike was driven, sent it anyway, and celebrations erupted across the nation. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. The journey that had taken months by wagon could now be made in days by train. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad made Stanford and his partners extraordinarily wealthy and powerful. They controlled transportation across the West. They owned vast tracts of land granted by the government. They influenced politics at every level. The Big Four became known as the Railroad Barons, and their power was both celebrated and resented. The Central Pacific, later reorganized as the Southern Pacific, dominated California's economy and politics for decades. The company set freight rates that could make or break businesses. It influenced elections through campaign contributions and controlled newspapers. The railroad's power became so great that California's legislature was sometimes called the Railroad Legislature because so many members were beholden to Southern Pacific interests. Stanford's business practices and political influence made him many enemies. Farmers resented the railroad's high freight rates. Competing businesses complained about monopolistic practices. Reformers attacked the corruption and political manipulation. The railroad's treatment of Chinese workers, who had been essential to construction but were then discarded and discriminated against, was particularly controversial. Stanford himself supported Chinese exclusion laws, despite the debt the railroad owed to Chinese labor. This hypocrisy was typical of the era's business leaders but no less troubling for being common. Despite the controversies, Stanford's wealth and power continued to grow through the 1870s and 1880s. He invested in other businesses, including wine production. He established extensive vineyards near Sacramento and became one of California's largest wine producers. He bred horses at his Palo Alto stock farm, developing a famous stable of trotters and thoroughbreds. His horse farms were among the most advanced in the world, using new techniques and technologies. Stanford was fascinated by animal locomotion and funded Edward Muybridge's pioneering photographic studies of horses in motion, work that contributed to the development of motion pictures. In 1885, tragedy struck the Stanford family. Their only child, Leland Stanford Jr., died of typhoid fever while the family was traveling in Italy. The boy was 15 years old, the center of his parents' world and the heir to the Stanford fortune. His death devastated Leland and Jane Stanford. In their grief, they decided to create a memorial that would benefit other young people. According to family legend, Stanford told his wife, "The children of California shall be our children." They decided to found a university in their son's memory. The Leland Stanford Junior University was established in 1885 on Stanford's Palo Alto stock farm. The university was to be non-sectarian, co-educational, and practical in its curriculum, focusing on preparing students for useful lives. Stanford endowed the university with his fortune, including the land, buildings, and an initial endowment. The university opened in 1891 with 559 students and a distinguished faculty recruited from across the country. Stanford served as president of the board of trustees and was deeply involved in the university's early development. The founding of Stanford University was perhaps Stanford's greatest legacy, transforming his wealth into an institution that would educate generations and become one of the world's leading universities. In 1885, Stanford was elected to the United States Senate, representing California. He served in the Senate until his death, though his service was not particularly distinguished. He focused on railroad interests and California concerns but was not a major legislative figure. His Senate career was marked by the same mixture of self-interest and public service that characterized his business career. He supported legislation favorable to railroads while also advocating for California's development. His wealth and political connections made him influential, but he was never considered a great senator. Stanford's later years were marked by increasing legal and financial troubles. The Southern Pacific Railroad faced numerous lawsuits over land grants, rates, and business practices. The federal government sued to recover loans made to the Central Pacific during construction. Stanford's personal finances became entangled with the railroad's finances in ways that were difficult to untangle. His relationship with his former partners, particularly Collis Huntington, deteriorated into bitter feuds over money and control of the railroad empire they had built together. Despite these troubles, Stanford continued to focus on his university. He attended the opening ceremonies in 1891 and remained actively involved in its governance. The university was his redemption, his way of transforming the wealth gained through ruthless business practices into something beneficial for society. He saw it as a living memorial to his son and a contribution to California's future. The university's motto, Die Luft der Freiheit weht, the wind of freedom blows, reflected Stanford's belief in practical education and individual opportunity, even if his own business practices had often limited opportunity for others. On June 21, 1893, Leland Stanford died at his home in Palo Alto, California. He was 69 years old. The cause of death was reported as heart failure. Stanford's death came at a time when his finances were in disarray and legal battles were ongoing. His funeral was attended by thousands, including business leaders, politicians, and university faculty and students. He was buried in the Stanford family mausoleum on the university campus, alongside his son. In death, as in life, Stanford was a figure of contradictions, remembered as both a builder and a robber baron. Stanford's estate was valued at approximately $30 million, an enormous fortune for the time. However, much of it was tied up in railroad holdings and real estate, and the estate faced numerous creditor claims. Jane Stanford fought for years to preserve the university endowment from creditors. She succeeded, ensuring that her husband's educational legacy would survive. The university nearly closed during the financial crisis of the 1890s, but Jane's determination and careful management saved it. She served as the university's benefactor and de facto leader until her own death in 1905. Stanford's legacy is complex and controversial. He was one of the builders of modern California and the American West. The transcontinental railroad that he helped create transformed the nation, enabling settlement, commerce, and communication on a scale previously impossible. It united the country physically in ways that would have lasting political and economic consequences. The railroad brought prosperity to California and opened the West to development. Yet this development came at tremendous human and environmental cost. Native American lands were seized. Chinese workers were exploited and then excluded. Competitors were crushed. Political systems were corrupted. The wealth of the railroad barons was built on government subsidies, questionable financial practices, and monopolistic control. Modern historians have judged Stanford harshly for his business practices while acknowledging his contributions. He was a product of the Gilded Age, an era when business ethics were minimal and government regulation was weak. He operated within the legal and ethical standards of his time, which permitted practices that would be considered corrupt today. He was not unusually unethical by the standards of his fellow railroad barons and industrialists. Yet this does not excuse the harm caused by his business practices or the inequality his wealth represented. Stanford University stands as his most enduring legacy. The institution has educated hundreds of thousands of students and has been at the forefront of research and innovation for over a century. Silicon Valley grew up around Stanford, and the university played a crucial role in the development of the technology industry. The university's success has vindicated Stanford's vision of practical, innovative education. Yet the university itself has grappled with the contradictions of its founding, acknowledging that its endowment came from exploitative business practices while celebrating its founder's vision. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Leland Stanford is that he was a man of his time, ambitious and capable, who built great things through methods that enriched himself at others' expense. He was neither a hero nor a villain but rather a complex figure who embodied both the achievements and the inequities of America's Gilded Age. His name graces one of the world's great universities, but it is also associated with corporate power and political corruption. He helped build the West while exploiting those who did the actual building. He created lasting institutions while engaging in practices that undermined democratic governance. In the end, Leland Stanford was a titan of American capitalism who accumulated vast wealth and power through the Transcontinental Railroad, used that power to dominate California's economy and politics, and ultimately sought redemption through philanthropy. His legacy includes both the railroad that united the continent and the university that bears his name. He is remembered today primarily for Stanford University, which is perhaps appropriate, as it represents his attempt to use his wealth for public benefit. Yet any complete assessment must acknowledge both his achievements and the human cost of those achievements, the exploitation and corruption that enabled his success, and the complex moral legacy of a man who was both builder and robber baron. John Pierpont Morgan was a towering figure in American finance and one of the most powerful bankers in history who shaped the modern American economy. John Pierpont Morgan, financier and industrial organizer, was born in Hartford, Connecticut on April 17, 1837. He came from a prominent banking family. He had a distinctive appearance marked by a disfiguring skin condition. Morgan's early years were marked by privilege and preparation for a life in finance. He attended elite private schools and received education in Switzerland and Germany, where he became fluent in both French and German. His education was interrupted periodically by health problems, including rheumatic fever, which would affect him throughout his life. His cosmopolitan education shaped his understanding of international finance and business, lessons that would prove invaluable in his later career. After completing his European education, Morgan began his banking career in 1857 at his father's London banking house. His father, Junior Spencer Morgan, was already an established banker with significant connections in both American and European financial circles. The young Morgan learned the intricacies of international banking, currency exchange, and the financing of international trade. These early experiences gave him insights into how capital flowed between continents and how financial power could be leveraged across borders. In 1858, Morgan moved to New York to work as an agent for his father's firm. He was just 21 years old but already possessed considerable knowledge of banking operations. His position involved facilitating transactions between American businesses and European investors. During this period, he began building the network of relationships that would later form the foundation of his financial empire. Morgan understood that banking was as much about personal relationships and trust as it was about numbers and transactions. Morgan's business ventures during the Civil War were controversial. He engaged in several transactions that, while legal, raised ethical questions. Most notably, he was involved in financing the purchase of defective rifles that were sold to the Union Army at a significant markup. The rifles, known as Hall carbines, had been rejected by the military but were purchased cheaply, refurbished minimally, and resold to the government at a profit. Morgan's role was as a financier rather than a principal, but the incident would later be used by critics as evidence of his willingness to profit from others' misfortune. Morgan also paid for a substitute to serve in his place in the Union Army, a legal practice at the time but one that highlighted the class divisions of the era. After the war, Morgan continued to build his banking business. In 1864, he formed a partnership and established his own firm. The business focused on foreign exchange and the sale of securities, particularly government bonds and railroad stocks. Morgan's European connections gave him a significant advantage in attracting foreign investment to American enterprises. European investors, particularly British investors, were eager to invest in American growth but needed trusted intermediaries. Morgan positioned himself as that intermediary, earning commissions and building influence. In 1871, Morgan partnered with the Drexel family of Philadelphia to form Drexel, Morgan and Company. This partnership significantly expanded his resources and influence. The Drexels were one of America's most prominent banking families, and the alliance gave Morgan access to their extensive client base and capital. The firm became one of the leading banking houses in America, competing with established firms like J. Cook and Company. Morgan's reputation for integrity and conservative financial management attracted clients who valued stability over speculation. Morgan's personal life during this period was marked by both happiness and tragedy. He married Amelia Sturgis in 1861, but she died of tuberculosis just 4 months after their wedding. The loss devastated Morgan and he threw himself into his work. In 1865, he married Frances Louisa Tracy, with whom he would have 4 children. His family life provided stability and social connections that complemented his business activities. The Morgans became prominent figures in New York society, known for their art collecting, philanthropy, and lavish lifestyle. The 1870s brought Morgan into the railroad business, which would become central to his career. American railroads were expanding rapidly but were plagued by financial instability, cutthroat competition, and poor management. Many railroad companies were overcapitalized, poorly constructed, and engaged in destructive rate wars that benefited no one. Morgan saw opportunity in this chaos. He began reorganizing troubled railroads, a process that became known as Morganization. His approach involved replacing management, restructuring debt, eliminating competition through consolidation, and installing his own representatives on boards of directors to ensure sound financial practices. Morgan's first major railroad reorganization was the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad in 1869. The railroad had been the subject of a bitter corporate battle, and Morgan intervened to resolve the conflict and restore financial stability. His success in this venture established his reputation as a railroad reorganizer. Over the following decades, he would reorganize numerous railroads including the New York Central, the Erie, the Reading, the Chesapeake and Ohio, and the Southern Railway. By the 1890s, Morgan controlled a vast railroad empire that dominated American transportation. The Panic of 1893 tested Morgan's power and influence. The economic crisis was triggered by railroad overexpansion, falling agricultural prices, and a run on gold reserves. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and unemployment soared. The crisis threatened to destabilize the entire American financial system. Morgan emerged as a stabilizing force, organizing syndicates to support failing institutions and working to restore confidence. His most dramatic intervention came in 1895 when the United States Treasury was running out of gold reserves needed to maintain the gold standard. President Grover Cleveland turned to Morgan for help. Morgan organized a private syndicate that purchased gold bonds from the government, providing the Treasury with the gold it needed to maintain the gold standard. The transaction was controversial because Morgan and his syndicate profited handsomely from the deal. Critics accused him of exploiting the government's desperation. However, Morgan's defenders argued that he had saved the country from financial collapse when no one else could or would. The incident demonstrated Morgan's unique position in American finance. He had become, in effect, a central banker for a nation that had no central bank. Following the 1895 gold rescue, Morgan's power and influence reached unprecedented levels. He was no longer simply a banker but a force that could shape the American economy. He used this power to reorganize and consolidate industries. His philosophy was that competition was wasteful and destructive. He believed that large, well-managed corporations were more efficient and stable than numerous small competitors engaged in cutthroat competition. This philosophy led him to organize some of the largest corporate consolidations in American history. In 1901, Morgan orchestrated the creation of United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. The deal involved purchasing Andrew Carnegie's steel empire for nearly $500 million and combining it with other steel companies to create a massive industrial combine that controlled over 60% of American steel production. The transaction shocked the nation with its scale. Carnegie reportedly said that Morgan was the only man who could have put together such a deal. The creation of U.S. Steel represented the apex of Morgan's power as an industrial organizer. Morgan's consolidation activities extended beyond steel and railroads. He organized the General Electric Company, bringing together competing electrical equipment manufacturers. He helped create International Harvester, combining agricultural equipment manufacturers. He was involved in organizing the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. By the early 20th century, Morgan and his partners held directorships in corporations representing billions of dollars in assets. The House of Morgan, as his banking empire was known, had become the most powerful financial institution in America. Morgan's appearance was distinctive and somewhat unfortunate. He suffered from rhinophyma, a skin condition that caused his nose to become bulbous, discolored, and disfigured. The condition worsened as he aged, and by his later years, his nose was severely deformed. Morgan was acutely self-conscious about his appearance and hated being photographed. He would reportedly pay photographers to destroy their negatives. Despite his physical appearance, or perhaps because of his sensitivity about it, Morgan cultivated an imposing and intimidating presence. He was known for his piercing eyes and his ability to dominate any room he entered. Morgan was a passionate art collector and philanthropist. He amassed one of the greatest private art collections in history, including paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, rare books, and decorative objects. His collecting was driven partly by genuine appreciation for art and partly by a desire to establish cultural credentials and compete with European aristocracy. He purchased entire collections, sometimes buying everything a dealer had to offer. His collection eventually filled multiple buildings and required professional curators to manage. Much of his collection was eventually donated to museums, particularly the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where he served as president. Morgan's religious life was important to him. He was a devout Episcopalian who attended church regularly and served as a senior warden at St. George's Church in New York. He believed that wealth brought responsibilities and that successful businessmen had obligations to society. However, his philanthropy was selective and often tied to institutions he personally valued. He supported churches, hospitals, museums, and educational institutions. He was less interested in broad social reform or addressing systemic poverty. His charitable giving reflected the paternalistic attitudes of the Gilded Age elite. The Panic of 1907 represented both the peak of Morgan's power and the beginning of the end of his dominance. The crisis began with the failure of several trust companies and quickly spread throughout the financial system. Banks refused to lend to each other, credit froze, and the stock market collapsed. With no central bank to provide liquidity, the financial system turned to Morgan. At 70 years old, Morgan took command of the crisis response. He organized meetings of bank presidents in his library, determined which institutions would be saved and which would be allowed to fail, and personally guaranteed loans to prevent further failures. Morgan's most dramatic intervention came when he locked the presidents of New York's trust companies in his library and refused to let them leave until they agreed to provide funds to save the weakest institutions. He reportedly stood at the door with the key in his pocket while the bankers negotiated inside. The image of Morgan single-handedly preventing financial collapse captured the public imagination but also raised disturbing questions. How could one private citizen wield such power? What if Morgan had not been willing to intervene? What if he had used the crisis for personal gain rather than public benefit? The Panic of 1907 led directly to calls for banking reform and the creation of a central bank. Many Americans concluded that the financial system could not continue to depend on the goodwill of a single banker. The National Monetary Commission was established to study banking reform, and its work eventually led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Ironically, Morgan's success in managing the 1907 crisis contributed to the creation of an institution that would replace private bankers like him as the ultimate source of financial stability. In his final years, Morgan faced increasing criticism and government scrutiny. The progressive era had arrived, and there was growing public hostility toward concentrated wealth and corporate power. In 1912, Morgan was called to testify before the Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation into the money trust. The committee sought to prove that Morgan and a small group of bankers controlled American finance and industry through interlocking directorates and informal agreements. Morgan, now 75 years old, appeared before the committee and defended his practices. During his testimony, Morgan made his famous statement that credit was based primarily on character rather than money or property. When asked about his power, he denied that he had extraordinary influence, claiming that people came to him because they trusted him. His testimony was often evasive, and he seemed genuinely unable to understand why people found his power problematic. He saw himself as a responsible steward of capital, not as a monopolist or a threat to democracy. The gulf between Morgan's self-perception and public perception was vast and unbridgeable. The Pujo Committee hearings were exhausting for Morgan. He was questioned for hours over multiple days, and the experience took a toll on his health. Shortly after the hearings concluded, Morgan left for a trip to Egypt, seeking to recover his strength and escape the controversies at home. However, his health continued to deteriorate during the trip. He suffered from depression and physical weakness. His famous vitality had abandoned him. On March 31, 1913, John Pierpont Morgan died in Rome, Italy. He was 75 years old. The official cause of death was given as a blood disorder, though his decline had been hastened by the stress of the Pujo hearings and general exhaustion. His body was returned to the United States and he was buried in Hartford, Connecticut, the city of his birth. His funeral was attended by thousands, including business leaders, politicians, and ordinary citizens who recognized that an era had ended with his passing. Morgan's estate was valued at approximately $80 million, far less than many people had expected. Much of his wealth was tied up in art collections and other assets rather than liquid capital. His son, Jack Morgan, inherited the banking business and continued to lead the firm, though he would never wield the personal power his father had commanded. The House of Morgan remained influential for decades, but the creation of the Federal Reserve and increasing government regulation meant that no private banker would ever again occupy the position Morgan had held. Morgan's legacy is complex and controversial. He was instrumental in organizing and modernizing American industry. His consolidations created efficiencies and eliminated wasteful competition. His reorganizations of railroads brought stability to a chaotic industry. His interventions during financial crises prevented economic collapse. He helped establish American corporations that would dominate their industries for generations. He was a major philanthropist whose art donations enriched American cultural institutions. However, Morgan also concentrated enormous power in private hands. His consolidations eliminated competition and created monopolies or near-monopolies in several industries. His close relationships with other bankers created what critics called the money trust, a small group of financiers who controlled access to capital and could determine which businesses succeeded or failed. His railroad reorganizations often benefited bondholders at the expense of stockholders and workers. His financial rescues, while effective, demonstrated the dangerous dependence of the American economy on private bankers. Modern historians have debated Morgan's role and significance. Some view him as a constructive force who brought order to chaotic markets and helped build modern industrial capitalism. They argue that his consolidations were necessary steps in economic development and that his character and integrity prevented him from abusing his power. Other historians view him as a robber baron who accumulated excessive power, stifled competition, and exploited his position for personal gain. They argue that his consolidations harmed consumers and workers while enriching a small elite. The truth about Morgan likely lies between these extremes. He was neither a hero nor a villain but a powerful banker who operated according to the values and assumptions of his time. He genuinely believed that large corporations managed by capable men were superior to competitive markets. He saw himself as a responsible steward bringing order and efficiency to American industry. He was also a businessman who profited enormously from his activities and used his power to advance his interests and those of his clients. Morgan's influence extended beyond his lifetime. The banking firm he built continued as J.P. Morgan and Company and later became part of J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the largest banks in the world. The corporations he organized, including U.S. Steel and General Electric, remained major industrial forces for decades. The Federal Reserve System, created partly in response to his dominance, became the cornerstone of American financial regulation. The debates about concentrated financial power that Morgan's career sparked continue to resonate in discussions about banking, regulation, and inequality. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Morgan's legacy was his demonstration of the power of finance capital in industrial society. Before Morgan, bankers had been important but secondary figures in the economy. Morgan showed that control of capital could translate into control of industry. His ability to organize, consolidate, and direct industrial development demonstrated that financial power could be as important as industrial innovation or entrepreneurial vision. This realization shaped economic development and political debates throughout the 20th century and continues to influence discussions about the role of finance in the economy. In the end, John Pierpont Morgan was neither simply a great financier nor simply a dangerous monopolist, but rather a complex figure who embodied both the creative and destructive aspects of American capitalism during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. His career illustrated how individual ambition and talent could create enormous wealth and power in a relatively unregulated economy. It also demonstrated the dangers of concentrated private power and the need for public institutions to provide stability and oversight. Morgan's legacy includes both the industrial infrastructure he helped build and the regulatory framework created to prevent any individual from wielding such power again. He remains today a symbol of both American financial genius and the excesses of unregulated capitalism, remembered for his power and his disfigured appearance rather than for the full complexity of his life and career.